When Sarah was 127 years old, she died at the place now called Hebron in the land of Canaan. There, Abraham mourned and wept for her. Although not much of her story is known outside of her husband, she is the mother of a nation, and hers is a story worth being remembered. Sarai's story begins with hardship. The first mention of her name in the Bible is accompanied with the reality of her infertility. This plagued her for almost 3/4 of her life. In an attempt to outsmart her situation, she suggested that her servant, Hagar, could be the solution to continuing Abram's bloodline, for the Lord had promised to make his descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. But when Hagar got pregnant with Abram's child, she began to act out against her master, treating Sarai with disrespect. Sarai blamed Abram for Hagar's bad behavior, but Abram told Sarai to treat Hagar as she saw fit, since Hagar was her servant. Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she ran away. 13 years after Ishmael, Hagar's son, was born, God again promised Abram, now Abraham, a son. This time, God promised Abraham a son specifically through his wife, now known as Sarah. When Sarah overheard the men speaking, she silently laughed to herself, thinking that 90 years of age was too far removed for childbearing age for this to be possible. But God noticed Sarah laughing and asked her, "Why are you laughing? Is anything too hard for the Lord?" But Sarah denied her laughter. 1 year later, Sarah held baby Isaac in her arms. God provided a son for Abraham through his wife Sarah, just as he had promised. Sarah passed away 37 years later and was buried in the land of Canaan, where her descendants would eventually come to live, just as God had promised. There are not many women mentioned in the Bible, and the few who are have amazing stories. Here are 4 women who are in Jesus' lineage. Tamar's story is confusing and messy. She was given to the firstborn son of Judah, Ur. Ur was evil in the Lord's sight, so the Lord killed him. Tamar was given to Judah's second son, Onan, but he disobeyed his father and the customs of the time, so the Lord killed him too. Tamar was promised by Judah to be married to his third son, but she was told to go and be a widow in her father's home while the third son grew up. Unfortunately, Judah forgot about his promise to Tamar, and after some very confusing situations, Tamar was pregnant with Judah's twins. One of these twins, Perez, is the ancestor of Salmon, who married Rahab. Rahab was a harlot in the city of Jericho. The 2 Israelite spies making their way up the wall stayed the night in Rahab's room. Rahab protected them from the soldiers of the king of Jericho, who came to ask if she knew where the spies were. Rahab went and pleaded for her life and the life of those she loves, and because she protected the lives of the spies, God granted her request, and she was spared from the destruction of Jericho. Ruth married into the Israelite nation and was happy, but her happiness did not last. After a plague left her husband, father-in-law, and brother-in-law dead, Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, told her 2 daughters-in-law to go back to their original families. Orpah left after much weeping. Ruth, however, begged Naomi to let her stay. Ruth promised that where Naomi went, she would go, and where Naomi stayed, she would stay. Ruth and Naomi's travels led them to Bethlehem. They were very poor and had trouble finding things to eat. So Ruth began to follow behind the workers of Boaz's field. Boaz saw Ruth and was moved when he heard of her commitment to Naomi. Boaz, being a good man, did all that he could to take care of Ruth and Naomi according to the laws of the land. They were married, and she bore Obed, the grandfather of King David. Bathsheba was the victim of lust. In those days, King David's army was at war with the Ammonites, and although tradition dictated that he should have gone with them, King David chose instead to stay at home. While strolling through his gardens, David spotted Bathsheba and wanted her for himself. David took Bathsheba, an already married woman, for his wife. David had her husband killed in battle, and although her story is wrapped in sin, Bathsheba was the mother of Solomon, who was one of the most famous kings of Israel. Each of these women's stories was surrounded by messy, confusing circumstances, and yet all four of them are featured in Jesus' lineage. God found favor in each of them, and their stories are redeemed by Jesus, their Son. Mary was 59 years old when she died. Her life outlasted that of her son, Jesus, and although she was buried in the tomb where he was laid, her life tells a rich story of God's love. Mary's story begins with wonder, but also shame. Mary was told by Gabriel, an angel of the Lord, that she was to bear the Son of God. But to those who did not know this, she was simply a woman who had gotten pregnant out of wedlock. But God was faithful to Mary, and Jesus was born in Bethlehem without any major complications. All of this was done to fulfill the multiple prophecies about the way the Messiah was to be born. After Jesus had been born, Mary and Joseph took him to the temple to be consecrated. Simeon, a righteous man, entered in and upon seeing the baby rejoiced. Simeon also gave a blessing to Mary, which included some troubling words about Jesus' eventual crucifixion. When Jesus was 12, Mary and Joseph took him to the temple in Jerusalem, as was their custom every year. This year, though, as Mary and Joseph left, Jesus stayed behind, discussing the scriptures with the teachers there. By the time Mary and Joseph realized he was missing and found him, Jesus had been in the temple for 3 days. Mary scolded Jesus, and although Jesus replied with words of wisdom well beyond his years, he obediently went home with his parents. Mary treasured all that had occurred in her heart, and the three returned home. Jesus, now a 30-year-old man, had been invited to a wedding along with his disciples and his mother, Mary. The wedding host had run out of wine, which was a major faux pas in the time. Mary turned to her son for help. Jesus was reluctant to help, but Mary simply ignored him and told the servants to do whatever he told them to do. Jesus performed his first miracle and afterwards left for Capernaum, along with his disciples Mary and the rest of their family. When Jesus was crucified, the Gospel of John specifically features Mary with 3 other women and with John. Mary was given into John's care by Jesus because he knew he would leave shortly after his resurrection. Mary was there with the disciples in the days before Pentecost. Mary's story continued after Jesus' death, and she is remembered throughout history for the part she faithfully played in God's master plan for the world. Throughout Jesus' time on earth, there were many women who were important parts of his life and ministry. Among those were Anna the prophet, the Syrophoenician woman, Joanna, and Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene sat at the tomb where Jesus had been laid, weeping. Suddenly, 2 angels stood before her. They asked her why she was crying, and she told them that the body of her Lord had been stolen. Jesus appeared before Mary, but she thought that he was the gardener. Jesus asked her who she was looking for. Mary asked if he knew where they had taken the body. After a moment, she finally recognized him. Then Jesus told her to go tell the others what she had seen. Years before, when Mary and Joseph took infant Jesus to the temple, they met Anna the prophet. Anna was an old woman who had never left the temple but worshipped night and day, fasting and praying. When she met Jesus, she gave thanks to God and told everyone about him. One day, while traveling in the region of Tyre, Jesus sought solitude in a house. But he was met there by a Syrophoenician woman who begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Jesus replied in rabbinical fashion with a question. The Syrophoenician woman answered with intelligence and great faith. Because of this, Jesus granted her request, and the demon was cast out of her daughter. Throughout Jesus' ministry, he traveled from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. He was accompanied by his 12 disciples, Joanna, the wife of Chusa, who had been the manager of Herod's household, and many other women who supported Jesus' ministry through their own means. After Jesus was crucified, his body was placed in a tomb. On the 3rd day, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb only to find it empty. After Jesus ascended into heaven, the apostles established the church in Jerusalem. As they traveled from place to place, telling others about Jesus, their numbers multiplied and spread throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria. This is the story of key believers mentioned in the book of Acts. In the nearby town of Joppa lived a believer named Tabitha, also known as Dorcas. Tabitha was known for doing kind things for others and helping the poor, until one day when she became ill and died. The other believers had heard that Peter was in Lydda, a town not far away, and so they sent for him, asking him to come as soon as possible. Peter asked the others to leave the room. When they had gone, he prayed over Tabitha and told her to get up. Her eyes opened, and the others returned to find her alive. There was much rejoicing, and the news spread all through the town. Time passed, and the apostles continued to spread the good news of Jesus throughout the land. As the church grew, King Herod Agrippa began to persecute the believers. He had the apostle James killed and Peter thrown into prison. But before he could be tried, an angel of the Lord helped him to escape. Once freed, Peter went to the home of Mary, the mother of John Mark, where many believers were gathered to pray for him. When Peter knocked at the door, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer it. However, when she heard his voice, she was so overjoyed that instead of opening the door, she ran back to the others. Rhoda excitedly told them that Peter was standing outside, but they thought that she was crazy or that it was an angel. As Peter continued to knock, the others joined Rhoda and opened the door. They were amazed and overjoyed that Peter was there, and he told them the story of his escape. The good news continued to spread and be multiplied as the Apostle Paul began his first missionary journey to Cyprus, Galatia, and Macedonia. While in Macedonia, Paul spent the Sabbath at a riverbank outside the city, where he spoke to some women who were gathered there. One of these women was Lydia from Thyatira, a merchant of expensive purple cloth. As she listened to Paul teach, the Lord opened her heart and she accepted what he was saying. Lydia and her entire household were baptized, and she invited Paul to stay in her home. Lydia continued to share the good news of Christ with the people of her town, and eventually a church was established there. She also continued to host Paul whenever he came around. These women and other believers were essential to the growth of the early church. Their faithfulness helped the apostles continue their missionary work. Many churches were established throughout the region, and the good news spread to the ends of the earth.